Oyez, 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 all persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court.
This is the first extended visit by television cameras inside the Supreme Court of the United States. On those 9 chairs sit the members of the most powerful judicial body in the world. For the last 17 years, that chair in the center, the chair of the Chief Justice of the United States, has been occupied by Warren Burger. He is retiring now from the court, and by custom, the other members will buy the chair as government surplus and present it to Warren Burger. That's appropriate not only because he has for so long helped to shape the laws of the land, but because he also has influenced the architecture of this room, changing the bench so that it is now arched instead of straight, the better for the justices to see one another, he says, and moving the press to one side, the visitors to the other. The business of the court remains in the center. The Supreme Court occupies chambers of dignity, even elegance. It wasn't always so. The earliest Supreme Courts had no home. They met infrequently in taverns in New York and Philadelphia. It was the 4th Chief Justice, John Marshall, who established the power and supremacy of the federal judiciary, as we shall hear from Chief Justice Burger, to whom Marshall is a hero. Warren Burger, to the surprise of the president who appointed him to the court, became on the bench his own man too, asserting again the supremacy of this court. This conversation with the Chief Justice began on the very day he submitted his resignation to President Reagan. He remains in office until the Senate confirms his successor, so the Chief Justice said he could not talk about cases recently or now before the court. I wondered why he is choosing to give up so much power. Why did he quit?
Chiefly, if not entirely, so that I can devote my full time to the work of preparing for the celebration of the bicentennial of the Constitution. I consider that celebration more important than my staying on the court for another couple of years.
But people are going to say, there's nothing in the world like the Supreme Court, and he's giving that up when he didn't have to.
Well, there it is.
The Burger Years, a CBS News special. General Motors sponsors this broadcast to honor the forthcoming bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. General Motors, mark of excellence.
Christopher, hi, it's me. How are you doing? You did? That's great. I can't wait to see it.
This man is an explorer.
Tell Mommy I'm on my way.
One of thousands at General Motors embarking on an odyssey into the unknown, filled with technological wonders that might seem like science fiction. But at GM, they're becoming reality now. Lasers that probe body structure, sophisticated instrument displays, computer-simulated testing, electronic navigation systems. But the road doesn't stop here. The 21st century lies dead ahead, and GM is leading the way there. Today's GM is evolving into a GM the future will demand, driving America down roads we've never been before. The GM Odyssey. Science, not fiction.
A CBS movie weekend begins Friday with Deborah Ratman as a mother.
Power, sensuality, that's what excites me.
Friends, family, that's what excites me.
Money, there's a lot of it out there, and I want to get mine.
It sounds funny, but the more you love to give, the more you keep.
In fact, getting it all and keeping it is the name of the game.
People want to be good if you just give them half a chance.
What people in Knots Landing want is what everyone wants. More. That's what it's all about.
In Knots Landing, I've learned the hard way.
There have been 40 presidents and only 15 chief justices. The founders of this republic wanted the judiciary to be beyond the control of politicians, so the chief justice is appointed for life. What this means is that these are two men of equal rank facing each other. The president is the head of the executive branch. The Chief Justice is the head of the judiciary. It may sound technical, but it cost Richard Nixon his political life.
So help me God.
Many people assume that the tapes must incriminate the president.
President Nixon at the time of the White House crimes known as Watergate. He's showing the American people some transcripts he said contained the entire Watergate story. They didn't. The transcripts had been heavily censored. The Supreme Court ordered Nixon to turn over the complete record to a special prosecutor. That was the end of Nixon's presidency.
The night your court issued that order to the president to turn the tapes over, did you sleep well?
I have no recollection of otherwise, no. No, if here you let what you're doing affect your sleep, other things affect my sleep. If you let that stop you, you'd be an insomniac.
What was the particular constitutional issue there?
Well, it was a constitutional issue that had really been decided in 1807 by John Marshall when he sat as the trial judge in the trial of Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr, able, brilliant lawyer that he was, said, I want to see all the reports that General Wilkinson had sent to Jefferson about his alleged treasonous activities. And Jefferson said, you can't do that. And Jefferson's lawyers had to tell him, yes, they can. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president's immune from a subpoena in a criminal case. Marshall, sitting as the trial judge, had sent them back and said, we want the whole report, no omissions. Some omissions had been made in the interests of, as Jefferson's people put it, the national interest. We would say today, the interest of national security. And in effect, I have to say, although the records are all there of the trial, Marshall was saying, I will look at the report and I will decide if there's some national security problems with a private look at the document. That was cited in the opinion.
So the issue was that every citizen must turn over evidence in a criminal trial, even the President of the United States.
Even you, as a journalist. Journalists don't like that, you know.
We'll come back to the press in a minute, but were you aware on that bench that what your court was deciding could in fact bring down the president who had appointed you? I'm just trying to get at the personal conflict that comes to judges from time to time. Even when
I can't speak of what was in the minds of the others. The train of events was moving, and it was clear that this was not going to stop the train of events. I suspect, although you'd have to ask the others, that's where the train was bound, and that there was nothing in between to prevent it from getting there.
Even a president has to say those 9 people have the last word?
It's the essence of our system, of divided and separated powers, checks and balances.
But even President Nixon accepted your word as the last word.
Yes, he did.
The court has the last word.
That's correct. And some presidents haven't. You remember Jackson, on one of John Marshall's famous decisions, adverse to what President Andrew Jackson wanted, said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him try to enforce it. And they never did enforce it. The court has no means of enforcing opinions. That must be done by the executive.
Except some prevailing tendency in the American tradition to submit to a higher law.
Yes, and President Nixon accepted this law. Now, that doesn't mean he agreed with it, but he accepted the concept that when this court acts, he, even as President of the United States, would accept it.
Did you consider President Nixon a brilliant man?
A very bright one. I'm never sure where brightness ends and brilliance begins. An extraordinarily bright man.
hard, isn't it, to look back? Can you think for a moment the most complex and difficult case you had to decide? Not the most important or the least important, but just the most difficult one, the one you really wrestled over more than any other?
No, every one of the capital cases is a painful experience.
Because?
The person is going to be put to death. Sometimes it isn't even very reassuring to look and find that person has been in the courts in trials for 12, 13, 14 years, had dozens of appeals, been heard by up to 100 judges at one time or another. And even when you look at the horror of the crime, it doesn't change the fact that the decision being made is this particular person is going to be put to death. That's not easy. No.
Are you implying that you oppose the death penalty personally?
No, I'm not implying it one way or the other. With respect to every case, every kind of question here, I try to put my private views out of the way. For example, sometimes with a group of college students, one of them is bound to get up. They're even more brash than White House correspondents with the president. And one of them is bound to get up and say, why are you in favor of the death penalty, killing people? And I answer that, why do you think I'm in favor of killing people, death penalty? Well, you vote to affirm convictions of the state court when they impose the death penalty. And I say, yes, I do. And when I do that, I'm following the Constitution of the United States, which gives the states the power to do that.
Where do you go in the Constitution to find confirmation that the states can put men to death?
No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, what's the other side of that coin? With due process of law, you may deprive a person of life, liberty, or property.
What about that phrase, cruel and unusual punishment, it says?
It isn't both.
What do you mean?
It isn't both cruel and unusual, because it's taking place every week. And I think 38 states have it. The 38 states don't make the constitutional law of this country. But if it is argued that this is a form of cruelty and unusual, hardly unusual when 38 or 37 states are doing it.
How do you go about trying to divine original intent of the fact framers on the very difficult issue of abortion?
There is no way on that case. I had intended to say that there are some cases where it's very clear and very easy to divine the original intent. In other cases, not. But where there is a record of what they thought, then we should look at it, and for the most part, we should be guided by it. But sometimes we're at large.
Isn't the issue of abortion one of the most divisive in America right now?
Probably.
How have you wrestled with that? I know that you've gone back and forth in your own mind from what I hear and from what I read.
No.
I mean, and just how do you make up your mind?
Well, I haven't gone back and forth.
About what the court should do?
No. In the most recent case to which you may have reference, I said we should be careful about about restraining the states from putting reasonable limitations. That's all.
But you still supported the 1973 Roe versus Wade.
I said in almost exactly the words in the opinion, the dissenting opinion, that if this case means what it seems to mean, perhaps the time has come to re-examine the whole subject. Now, that doesn't tell you very much, but...
It's certainly a hint to the next court, isn't it?
I don't know that I would define it that way. I'm not sure how I would define it. I was reflecting what's going on in my mind.
To what extent is the court bound by its own previous decisions?
Constitutional?
Yes, sir.
It's perfectly clear that the court has greater flexibility with respect, and exercises that flexibility with respect to changing its views on constitutional questions than decisions in which we say what a statute means.
Wasn't Roe versus Wade a constitutional issue?
Yes, it was. So there's I'm just saying broadly.
I see it.
You see, you want to talk about that one case, I want to talk about the generality of cases.
No.
Constitutional cases, constitutional jurisprudence is open to the court to change its position in view of changing conditions, and it has been done.
And what does it take for the court to reverse itself?
5 votes.
How do you read original intent on the question of school prayer? And you're almost off the bench. I'm not asking you to talk about cases. I'm just asking, how do you go about finding the original intent on the question of prayer in school, since there were no public schools in those days?
Well, of course, you can't find original intent, as I said in our earlier discussions, on every detail. That's impossible, utterly impossible. Up to the time I was in about the 3rd grade, we had the Lord's Prayer every morning in school. I don't remember whether it went beyond that. We didn't give it any thought one way or the other. I'm not sure we were listening very carefully.
That's a good argument against a prayer that becomes only a ritual and has no deep significance to those uttering it.
3rd-year-olds can be forgiven for a little bit of inattention on those things.
Why do you think this issue so stirred up the country?
Well, I don't really think it has stirred the country as much as your question suggests. It's stirred up parts of the country and some people. It would do no harm. But the question is whether it is permitted. Certainly the moment of silence, in one opinion, I made my view perfectly clear.
That you were for a moment of silence.
It wouldn't do any harm if we had a moment of silence as soon as we get in here in the morning. We do, in a sense, while the marshal is crying out and finishes with a prayer, God save the United States and this honorable court. When I was on the Court of Appeals, there were 9 judges there, and I was the junior for a long time. And the chief judge, now long gone, took this issue, said he didn't think the court should be having God save the United States in this honorable court. This was a violation of the clause, and the discussion went around a little bit. There wasn't much. And one judge, Walter Bastian, a very great practical judge, had been a leading lawyer in Washington, said, well, if the court votes 8-1 not to have that statement made, when we come into the courtroom and I'm there, I will rise and say, God save the United States in this honorable court. That was the end of the debate.
Isn't that just the point, that prayer is such a matter of individual conscience that the state should have nothing to do with it?
That's been the general trend in recent years, that a tolerance of a great many things in religion.
Now, I detect you personally would be in favor of letting children pray in school, but you won't.
No, you detect wrong then.
It happens with us journalists.
Yes, I think, yes, all too often. The moment of prayer, the minute of prayer, the minute of silence should be for whatever a child wants to do. We all need a little time. I don't think it's an issue that is crying to be resolved, that is actual prayer in the school. The place for prayer is at home primarily, and in church facilities, and whether we have it in schools or not is not going to affect the Republic in terms of its falling.
How do you grope for the constitutional intent there? Because there were no public schools. You don't.
You can't find it, except a very great tolerance of prayer everywhere. one man said once, when he was asked about prayer in the House and the Senate, and his answer was, I know of no body of men on earth more in need of divine guidance than the members of the Congress. So it hasn't seemed to hurt the Congress very much.
Tell Mommy I'm on my way.
General Motors is embarking on an odyssey down roads paved with technological wonders that might seem like science fiction. But at GM, they're becoming reality now. Laser body testing, sophisticated instrument displays, electronic navigation systems. The 21st century lies dead ahead, and today's GM is leading the way there. The GM Odyssey. Science, not fiction.
Off the road, we went through a bunch of construction signs and hit a tree. Unfortunately, I was wearing my seatbelt, and I felt the seatbelt. I could feel it holding me in place as I was being thrown all around the car. I did about 3 spins.
It totaled the car, but I was okay.
It's been proven by General Motors research and by people all across America. Seatbelts save lives. So please, buckle up.
And it only takes a minute.
Excellence in education begins here in our General Motors facilities, for there is a new world of industry being born, and General Motors people are preparing themselves for it. More than 1 million hours of education are required to prepare the people who will staff one new plant. To encourage excellence in the arts, we begin with young people, co-sponsoring with 17 Magazine a national classical music competition exclusively for high school age musicians. Here you see the Opera Company of Philadelphia, Luciano Pavarotti International Voice Competition. General Motors is pleased to sponsor a broadcast of the Verdi Requiem conducted by Lauren Mazel and starring Maestro Pavarotti and 3 of the winners of the competition. And we have made a major financial commitment to the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, in keeping with our policy of fostering and celebrating excellence in science, education, and the arts.
People ask me, what is Ewing Oil? What are you people all about? Well, we're about like anybody else, just a little bigger. I fought my own brother, my own mother for the future of this family. And that's what it's all about. People say, JR, with all that money, you still can't buy love, trust, and respect. And they're right. But you can try.
After the British had been defeated, the best way to describe America was the disunited states. Each colony thought itself a separate country. For example, New Jersey created a customs barrier against New York, which it considered a foreign nation. 9 of the states had separate navies. Virginia threatened to use its fleet against Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Massachusetts if they didn't pay customs duties. The disunited states were in need of something that would bring them together, a convention that might settle the disputes. At first, Rhode Island refused even to send delegates, since she feared that small states might get obliterated by a federation. But logic, necessity, and the men of the time drew these states together. A remarkable document was drawn up called the Constitution of the United States of America. It is one of the great political documents ever. As almost an afterthought, it provided for a Supreme Court to arbitrate disputes between the states.
Those 13 sovereigns were really 13 separate countries. There's one story about the New Jersey troops showing up at Valley Forge to report for duty to Washington. And some sergeant major or other fellow was sent out to say, raise your right hand. What for? To swear allegiance to the Continental Congress or whatever. And so their spokesman said, no, our country is New Jersey. Our country is New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And that was the attitude of the people of most of the states.
So the Constitutional Convention 200 years ago, next year, was called out of fear of what the disunity brought about by the Articles of Confederation would produce.
I can't remember whether it was Dickinson or one of the Morrises who, in responding to some of the debate at Philadelphia, said, if we have no fear, there need be no fear that this national government is going to swallow up the states. The fear is that the states will swallow any effort to have a national government. And that was a close call. You remember 3 delegates, I think it was, refused to sign the Constitution. Only 39 of the total number of 78 designated delegates signed the Constitution.
Narrow escape, wasn't it?
Very narrow.
What was it that brought these men to compromise? Farmers, planters, lawyers, the youngest 27, the oldest 81, some scholars, some hadn't even been to college.
Well, the fact that a few men, like principally I would say Madison, but the Morrises and Dickinson and Hamilton, who had thought about it for a long time, and Madison, who had come many weeks in advance of the convention and laid out a lot of these books that he'd had Jefferson send him from Europe, and studied every system of government that had ever been used up to that time. And they were prepared. They had not the details, but they knew where they wanted to go, that they wanted a system of divided powers, and they wanted the checks and balances. Those were the two key things, and they succeeded on both scores.
What is your reading of why these men at that convention counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation, and wrote into the Constitution a provision that a slave who ran away had to be returned to his property, to his owner in the original state? How do you read that?
One of the many compromises of the convention. One of the delegates wrote home at the end of the convention, or near the end, and said the whole thing was accomplished by compromise after compromise after compromise, but we wanted to get something done.
And if they had not compromised on this, the South would not have gone along?
Probably not. The southern states were fearful of some of these things because they were entirely dependent on cotton, tobacco, and slavery. They couldn't function without it.
So it was, as is often the case, economics that drove these men to agreement.
Some of them.
Some of them.
No.
When did the first real test come for the new government, for the new court?
1803 in Marbury against Madison.
Marbury versus Madison.
That's the book I brought along with me here.
What's the significance of it?
Because it made it clear that no legislative body could tear the Constitution up and throw it away, or ignore it.
So Chief Justice John Marshall really said this is a national...
This is supreme.
This is, the Constitution is supreme.
Because it's perfectly clear that if legislative bodies could ignore the Constitution, you might as well not have one.
And they had to realize that someone had to have the final say as to what was constitutional.
Someone must decide is one of the famous issues, one of the famous sentences that you could put to it. Someone must decide.
So Marbury versus Madison was the first time the Supreme Court had declared an act of Congress unconstitutional.
Right.
And it stuck.
They didn't do it again for 54 years.
How do you explain that?
No case came up.
But the principle was established.
Principle was established.
That the court was supreme, literally supreme.
Yes.
Do you think the men who wrote that Constitution would be surprised today at a government that can, behind the Constitution, subsidize the arts and education, support universities, acquire huge tracts of wilderness, raise taxes for Social Security, Medicare for the poor, and decide when cases of when pregnancy should be terminated? Do you think the founders really anticipated the...
Well, if you bunch all of them together, you've created more of a problem than if you just took some of them. I think if you drew them right out of eternity, right here, with no chance to go to the library and read what happened in between, unless by some process they're following it, some of them would be surprised on some things. In general, I think they would not be. John Marshall said once, and I think we're using one of those quotes, the Constitution was made for the ages. Now, sometimes when his reference to it as a living document means you can do anything you want with it. That's not so. But a commerce clause that never heard of even a steamboat. The steamboat hadn't been invented. As the conditions change, you've got to try to figure out what the Constitution means in relation to that particular problem.
And it's the court that decides that.
We do the best we can.
So the law is not just ancient ink on a parchment written in 1786.
No, it isn't like the rules of a chess game or a lot of other things. Too many variables.
It's precedent.
You're dealing with human beings, and as long as you've got fallible human beings running governments, then Congress is going to make mistakes, the president's going to make mistakes, and the judges are going to make mistakes.
What do the people do when the judges make a mistake? Look how long the judges held that black Americans were 2/3 a citizen and property. What do the people do when the court makes a mistake?
Do just what they did ultimately. The political process ultimately catches up with it. A little bit like Elizabeth Barrett Browning's lines, things so wrought must be unwrought so. When you pass a law, if you're going to try to unpass it, you've got to do it the same way. Both houses and the president, not one house. Congress can review us and change us when we decide a statutory question, and frequently do. But when we decide a constitutional issue, right or wrong, that's it until we change it. Or the people change it. Don't forget that. The people made it, and the people can change it. The people could abolish the Supreme Court entirely
by
a constitutional amendment. Change the Constitution.
You know, there have been threats to have a constitutional convention to do something like that. What do you think about a constitutional convention?
Well, I've answered that a couple of times. You mean a whole new constitutional convention? A grand waste of time. And even worse than that, if there are specific problems, they should be addressed by specific amendments to that particular problem, and then let the American people decide them one by one.
Christopher, hi, it's me. How are you doing? You did? That's great. I can't wait to see it.
This man is an explorer.
Oh, Mommy, I'm on my way.
One of thousands at General Motors embarking on an odyssey into the unknown, down unmapped roads paved with scientific and technological wonders that might seem like science fiction. But at GM, they're becoming reality. Now, lasers that probe body structure as no man's eyes ever could. Instrument displays and controls more accessible to eyes and hands. Computer-simulated aerodynamics that test more designs more quickly for optimum fuel economy.
Let's see if the program corresponds well to the barrier test we ran last week.
Crashing cars before they're ever built with people that don't exist.
Let's modify the IP and run it again.
Where am I?
Electronic navigation systems that tell you where you are and how to get where you're going. But the road doesn't stop here. The 21st century lies dead ahead, and GM is leading the way there. Today's GM is evolving into a GM the future will demand. Bolder, daring, more responsive, driving America down roads we've never been before. The GM Odyssey. Science, not fiction.
Someday, even when it seems like she hasn't a clue.
What is going on?
No matter how puzzling the circumstances.
I haven't the vaguest idea.
The perfect solution is Murder, She Wrote. The
word on the street is mafia. A brave Sicilian mayor leads a deadly war on crime. West 57, tonight.
You know, I've never seen a case argued here. What happens? What do you do?
You sit here until your case is called. And when your case is called, you get up and...
Yeah, you don't have a string, and then there you know.
You get up, and then if the lectern is too low for your notes, this thing needs oil. You just set it, and when that amber light goes on, that means you've got 5 minutes left, and when the red one goes on, you're supposed to stop. It was said of Hughes, and this same thing was here when Hughes was here, that he would stop a lawyer in the middle of the word if.
The story is that you would point your finger at, that the wife said you were pointing...
Oh, yes, when I argued a case that was hotly argued, and that was in the days when they allowed full 1 hour argument. When I came here, we cut it down to 30 minutes. And the bench was straight at that time. And the justices would interrupt each other because they couldn't hear each other and they couldn't see each other very well. And several times it happened, and on one occasion at least, Hughes, Justice Black was over there, and Reed was on this side. And I'm sure I just put my hand up and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Justice Black, I'm trying to listen to Justice Reed's question." She says I pointed my finger.
Your wife?
Yes, I said, no. That must have been somebody else.
What's the difference between the Chief Justice and the other 8? Are you just more, are you just first among equals?
That's it. First among equals is it. And then I have about 35% more work to do on the administrative side, about a third.
What power do you have?
The power of assignment of opinions is about the only power that the Chief Justice has.
What do you mean?
When we vote, if the Chief Justice is in the majority, then I decide who's going to write the opinion.
And why is that important?
Well, it's quite important.
How?
In my view, I take into account who will write the narrowest opinion.
Narrow?
The narrowest. Just enough to decide that case.
And not go beyond
not
that?
Go beyond that. And decide some other case. If you get beyond the things that you must decide, there is the risk that you're deciding something when it hasn't been fully explored and presented.
Do you actually sit around and discuss a case and try to reach an agreement on it, or do you each submit?
Oh, no. We sit at that conference table in there from early in the morning till late in the afternoon with an 11 o'clock coffee break. Coffee and tea. That's 5 to 7 minutes. And then we break 45 minutes for lunch. And that's it.
Is it conducted in the most judicial restraint possible, or?
There's never been a voice raised in the 17 years I've been here. Now, I'm sure maybe blood pressure has gone up. I'm not sure of that. It's civilized discourse.
And then what happens?
And then we take a vote, and everybody has the same score sheet, and on the back of the score sheet are little notes about what each justice said. That helps when it comes to making the assignment.
Are they passed up to you?
No, that's private.
So if you tend to side with a judge who makes a very compelling case on an opinion, you might give him, in an argument, you might give that judge the chance to write the opinion because he or she will make the strongest case?
That's a factor. That's a factor.
How differently, Mr. Chief Justice, does the world look when you're up there looking down on this scene from how it looks when you're down here looking up at those 9 judges?
I have found over 17 years sitting in there, when you get in, your mind is so filled with the case and getting it moving. I rarely have focused on that. Sometimes I look down at the tourists and think to myself, this must sound like Greek to them. It's just gibberish from the point of view of the ordinary tourist. But then they do want to come in and see the process.
Would you ever be in favor of these cameras being here for arguments?
Never. I once said early, over my dead body, and then I reflected and thought this might give the networks too much of a temptation. And so I just say, no. We'd had television in the convention. Do you think we would have got a constitution?
No, in fact, I think one of the reasons for the success of the Constitution was the iron code of silence that bound all of the members who there. You know, there was no verbatim transcript. Madison wouldn't let his notes be published until after his death. It was 38 years after the convention.
You're going to be excommunicated not only from the Baptist Church, but from the journalistic fraternity.
Well, like you, I've been on both sides of the fence. Do you think broadcasters should have the same protection of free expression that newspapers do?
Sometime when I'm not a United States judge in active service, I might address that question.
You're going to be out of service fairly soon.
A couple of months, maybe.
I'll give you my word, it won't air before any decision you make.
Well, some other time we'll talk about it. Television looks to me as though it has a great deal of freedom. I didn't know that they were denied as much freedom.
Do you think the First Amendment gives the press certain liberties that other ordinary citizens don't have?
Well, in the first place, they take it whether they have it or not. And in the second place, yes, the press has got to have access to some places that there's no occasion to just let any tourist walk in if they're going to perform their function.
What do you see as the values, the fundamental values underlying the constitutional protection of free expression? What were the founders trying to do?
Well, there are only about 8 words in the Constitution about freedom of the press. They're very important words to not just to the press. They're just as important to me and every citizen in the country as they are to you. But they wouldn't be worth a snap of your finger if it weren't for the rest of the Constitution. Article 3. If there weren't an independent judiciary to protect those 8 or 9, however many words, it wouldn't have very much meaning. Nothing is more important in the Bill of Rights than the First Amendment, with the freedom of expression, of association, of religion.
It would seem to me that almost all of our constitutional guarantees are dependent on that First Amendment right to freely express our opinions. It seems to me that's what makes us really different. The power of self-correction.
Well, it's related to the checks and balances, which are built right into the Constitution. A free press helps protect an independent judiciary. And without an independent judiciary, you wouldn't have any free press.
I'll tell you what troubles some people today, and tell me what you think about this, is that to be heard in America, you almost have to be a celebrity or have great wealth. That today, free speech becomes what you can afford to buy.
I don't know. I got quite a bit of exposure for nothing.
But you were an official. You were in high place.
I think that's a philosophical subject I've read a few things about. It's something that's got to be watched very closely.
You know, in some of the cases that have come before your court, Virginia Pharmacy, Buckley, others, the court expanded the First Amendment protection of commercial speech. But in others, Miller, Young, FCC, you contracted the protection of political speech in unconventional forms like a booth at a state's fair. And isn't the point that a pamphlet you put out is not the same as the ability to buy an ad across from the editorial page of the New York Times, that you're saying, in effect, it's not free equal speech, it's unequal speech that's not free?
Well, come and see me sometime when I become Chief Justice Emeritus, and maybe we can talk about that.
You mean we should have done this after you leave the court?
I don't think you'll be very much interested then.
You don't think you think you're losing your power base?
I wouldn't call it, long live the king is dead, long live the king.
You know, Mr. Chief Justice, I'm fascinated by the question, what makes a judge? Justice Benjamin Cardozo once said that forces deep below consciousness shape a judge's work. I suppose they shape all of our lives as well. But have you ever thought about the events and the people who shaped your life?
I was brought up on what we now call the work ethic in a household of mostly 10, 7 children, my parents, and usually one of the grandparents. I started working when I was not later than age 10, and I've never been unemployed until now. Since then, a great variety of kinds of work.
Was it a happy home?
Yes, it was.
Religious home?
7, yes. We were Methodists in the Methodist church then. And we were Presbyterians by accident. The Methodist church had long stairways, just like the Supreme Court. And Mrs. Berger had a lifelong cardiac condition from having rheumatic fever as a child, probably. And the Presbyterian church had 2 steps. And it was nearby, and I never could quite understand the difference between the two. Which meant I wasn't either a very good Presbyterian or a very good Methodist.
When you were a boy, did you have any images in your mind of what you wanted to be when you grew up?
A lawyer, that's all.
Where did that come from?
In 4th grade in school, the teacher called my mother and said there's something wrong with this boy. Take him home and call a doctor, and they called the doctor. My condition was diagnosed as having had polio that year. I was out of school the entire year. Oh. And the teacher, knowing that I probably wouldn't be absorbed with arithmetic books, sent a bundle of books home every week by my sisters and brothers, and they were biographies, autobiographies.
Lawyers, politicians?
Mostly lawyers.
Do you remember the first time you walked into this court?
Yes, I do.
You remember what you thought? Or was it too long ago?
Not particularly, because I still carry the impressions from the first time I saw the court when it sat in the old building.
Which was?
And Hughes was presiding. It was just after I came out of law school, and I was here in 1933, and went in that chamber, which is now the restored Senate chamber.
You remember the impression it made on you?
Yes, almost all the men on that court, I think Cardozo was the single exception, were over 6 feet tall. Hughes with that beard, which, as people often said, he looked more like God than God, and he acted that way. I don't mean in any arbitrary sense that he was rough, but he was very firm, very stern, very dignified, as John Marshall was on the bench, but not off.
You were a young man running around Washington on those visits when the Franklin Roosevelt was trying to pack the court. What did you think about all that?
I was in law school when part of that took place, and I was involved with the other young lawyers debating against the court packing plan.
Nowadays, the president doesn't have to pack the court, he just has to stack it slowly.
Well, if you were getting into that, you'd find that that happened very recently under a prior administration.
Every president tries to do that, doesn't he, if he gets a chance?
Every president tries to pick responsible people. There are only 2 things that should be considered. Integrity and professional competence. And that if that gives you 50% women and or 50% minority people, or only 10% minority people, that's irrelevant. The judicial system is not supposed to be representative in the sense that the Congress is representative. It should be integrity and professional ability.
That's the ideal, but of course every president wants integrity and competence plus personal philosophy, political philosophy, that agrees with his agenda.
He tries.
Assuming that the 2 nominations are confirmed, will President Reagan finally have the court he wants?
I don't think the court will be much different from what it is right now.
That's not what a lot of conservatives out there think.
Well, I can't...
who've been waiting for the chance to...
I can't help them with their thinking except say what I think. I don't think decisions will be fundamentally affected by this change.
The Heritage Foundation, a conservative group here in Washington, says the Burger Court has been not that much different from the Warren Court, too liberal.
It's always been somewhat comforting to know that I have been castigated by so-called liberals for being too conservative and castigated by so-called conservatives for being too liberal. Pretty safe position to be in.
Where do you come down?
I don't know. That's for others to decide, if those terms have any real validity at all.
Here we are some time after you made your decision that you were leaving that court. And people want to believe you, and they still find it hard to accept that you would really believe that the commission on the bicentennial, nice and nostalgic as it is, could be as important as this court for whatever time you had left on it. Why?
Well, if I took your premises, I'd have to come to one conclusion. But let me straighten out the premises. I consider the bicentennial of the Constitution, the program, telling the story of how it was founded and what it means, a civics and history lesson for all of us, not just for people out there, including myself, because I've been learning some new things. More important than whether I stay in that center chair for another year or another 2 years.
How would you like for us to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution?
Go through the story of its founding. With all these problems, when people thought of themselves as Virginians first and Americans second, look to a later point, nearly 100 years later, right after Fort Sumter, Lincoln sensed there was going to be a war between the North and the South. So he called General Winfield Scott, who was chief of staff, and Lincoln said, we're in effect, we're going to have a war. Who should be the commander of the United States forces? So General Winfield Scott said, it's easy. He's right down here at Arlington, Lieutenant Robert E. Lee. That's your man. And so a messenger went to Lee and said, Lincoln wants you to take it over. Bear in mind, Lee was against slavery, had no slaves. He was against secession from the Union. He was in favor of maintaining the Union. But he was a Virginian in his spirit and mind, really, before he was an American. And he resigned from the Army, wrote his resignation that night, packed his bags, and got a train for Richmond, and offered his services for the limited purpose of defending Virginia. That was all at the time.
He considered himself more a Virginian than an American.
No.
He couldn't take the oath to that Constitution.
Just think, from the Revolutionary War, almost 100 years, this was still the frame of mind of a great many people. Yeah. And to pull that together into a union that would function was something that Madison understood, Washington understood it, Hamilton understood it, and they put this thing together with separated, divided powers, theoretically co-equal, for checks and balances.
We're still a very young country. You've lived over a third of the life of this country, a third of the life of that Constitution. No. So we're still learning what the Constitution is, what America is about.
Yeah, and another 100 years from now, we'll be still at it.
off the road, went through a bunch of construction signs, and hit a tree. Unfortunately, I was wearing my seatbelt, and I felt the seatbelt. I could feel it holding me in place as I was being thrown all around the car. I did about 3
It totaled the car, but I was okay.
It's been proven by General Motors research and by people all across America. Seat belts save lives. So please, buckle up.
And it only takes a minute.
Tell Mommy I'm on my way.
General Motors is embarking on an odyssey down roads paved with technological wonders that might seem like science fiction. But at GM, they're becoming reality now. Laser body testing, sophisticated instrument displays, electronic navigation systems. The 21st century lies dead ahead, and today's GM is leading the way there. The GM Odyssey. Science, not fiction.
Thursday, the music, the legends, the superstars. It's a spectacular night of country music with Loretta Lynn, Larry Gatlin, Roy Acuff, Richie Skaggs, Willie Nelson, the Oak Ridge Boys, Alabama, Dolly Parton, and over 120 stars celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Grand Ole Opry.
The Burger Years, a CBS News special. General Motors has sponsored this broadcast to honor the forthcoming bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. General Motors, mark of excellence.
On the street is radio contests. Cashing in on the contest craze can turn some fans into fanatics. West 57th tonight.
Times